On the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, 15,000 proud veterans of the Army of Northern Virginia launched a grand attack on superior Yankee positions on Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg. The high tide of the Confederacy was just moments away. The local Confederate commander was Major General George Pickett, and it is his name which has forever been linked to the doomed advance which saw 10,000 brave men fall in a fruitless attempt to storm the Federal lines. On that fateful day, rebel courage and valor withered in the face of a maelstrom of Yankee shot and shell. As the battered and bleeding survivors staggered back to their own lines, one man alone mattered to the retiring soldiers. He rode among them, asking for forgiveness and praising their extraordinary bravery. In the face of this horrific reverse, still no voices were raised against him, for this was Robert E. Lee, the beloved commander of a now shattered army. In the midst of despair, he was once again to show the qualities which made him the object of such devotion from his men, even in the greatest adversity. Lee unequivocally took full responsibility for the debacle. "Come, General Pickett," he said to the grief-stricken commander, "this has been my fight. Upon my shoulders rests the blame." In May 1862, the nightmare of Gettysburg still lay in the future, but Confederate fortunes were almost as perilous as they would be in the wake of that great reverse. The rebels had failed to win a battle against the Yankees since the first Bull Run fought in 1861, almost a year before. Events at Shiloh, New Orleans, the Far West, and the Peninsula had all provided the increasingly bad news for the Confederacy. Further cause for despair arose from the news that the wounded Confederate General Joseph Johnston was to be replaced by the hitherto unknown and untested General Robert E. Lee. Lee inherited an army at its lowest ebb. The Confederacy itself was in the greatest danger. Its days appeared to be numbered, and the men knew it. A mere 100 miles separated the rebel capital at Richmond and the Yankee capital at Washington. But by a firm application of superior naval strength, the Union forces had managed to bring the threat of capture to the very doorstep of the Confederate capital. The Federal General G.B. McClellan, with 130,000 troops, had launched an amphibious assault of the Confederate capital via the strip of land known as the Peninsula. He was supported by McDowell, advancing from the north with a further 40,000 men. To oppose these two forces, Joseph Johnston, the Confederate general, had at his disposal a mere 50,000 effectives. Outnumbered and outgunned, the rebels made a series of withdrawals until finally they could retreat no further and were forced to turn and give battle at Fair Oaks, Virginia, on May 30th, 1862. The Battle of Fair Oaks was characterized by mismanagement and ineptitude on the part of the Confederate forces. Confusion reigned, and to cap it all, General Joseph Johnston was wounded as he tried to bring order to the chaos. That night, a dejected President Jefferson Davis handed command of the broken army to the only man he felt he could trust. The situation was critical, but as so often happens in those dark moments, come the hour, come the man. That man was Robert E. Lee. Davis's faith in Lee was not misplaced. The new commander immediately summed up the situation and decided he must summon Stonewall Jackson to his aid. To an extent, he had no alternative. Jackson's was the only other Confederate field army left which Lee could call on. So Jackson and his 17,000 men were secretly moved from the approaches to the Shenandoah Valley in order to take part in Lee's first great battle. The battle was in fact destined to become a series of battles known to posterity as the 7 Days, which culminated in the Confederate victory at Gaines' Mill. For the first time in over a year, the Union forces were clearly and decisively defeated by the rebels. The superior Yankee forces retreated with such haste that tons of desperately needed supplies were left to fall into the Confederate hands. So much, it was reported, that Confederate quartermasters needed 3 days just to record the booty. Lee had won his first victory, and with it, the respect of his men. There's nothing like the scent of success to revitalize a tired army. And as the dispirited Yankees pulled back towards their eventual withdrawal from the peninsula, spirits soared in the rebel army. The men had found a leader they admired and respected. This was to be the beginning of a bond between them, which would never be broken.
We gotta help old General Lee. Eliza Jane. I'm singing, oh, Eliza, Eliza Jane. I'm singing, oh, Eliza, Eliza Jane. We're the boys of the 1st Brigade. Eliza Jane. We never run 'cause we got it made. Eliza Jane. I'm singing, oh, Eliza, Eliza Jane. I'm singing, oh, Eliza, Eliza Jane. If you see us coming, better step aside. Eliza Jane. A lot of men didn't.
Even in victory, Lee, as he always would, reserved his first consideration for his men. He left us these words in the aftermath of a Confederate victory, which typify the spirit of the man.
I have returned to my old quarters and am filled with gratitude to our Heavenly Father for all the mercies He has extended to us. Our success has not been so great or complete as we could have desired, but God knows what is best for us. Our enemy met with a heavy loss, from which it must take some time to recover before he can recommence his operations.
The army which Lee commanded was filled with volunteers, and in many cases whole families had volunteered together. General Lee's family was no different, and his sons and cousins were serving in its ranks even before he rose to prominence. His son, Robert Jr., left us a moving account of his own early life in the Army. At the time of the initial victories in the peninsula, he was still a lowly artilleryman in the newly christened Army of Northern Virginia.
On that particular morning, we were parked in an open field, already waiting orders. Most of the men were lying down to get some shade and to be out of the way. I'd crawled under a caisson and was busy making up many lost hours of rest. Suddenly, I was rudely awakened by a comrade prodding me with a sponge staff and was told to get up and come out, that someone wished to see me. It took me a moment or two to realize what it all meant, but when I saw my father's loving smile, it became clear to me that he'd ridden by to see if I was safe and how I was getting along. I remember well how curiously those with me gazed at me, and I'm sure it must have struck them as very odd that such a dirty, ragged, unkempt youth could have been the son of this grand-looking and victorious commander.
They may have been victorious in the peninsula, but the reborn army and its new commander still faced a daunting task. McClellan had withdrawn from the peninsula, but there was still the threat that he would link up with the field army of Major General John Pope. Together, the combined forces of Pope and McClellan would be 180,000 strong, too strong for the Confederate 60,000. So Robert E. Lee embarked on an audacious scheme to carry the war to the heart of his enemy and preempt their actions. Despite the superior numbers ranged against him, he would invade the North. Lee's first target was the army of John Pope, a commander whom he knew from his days at West Point, and whom he held in the deepest contempt, as his letters have shown.
When you write to Rob, tell him to catch Pope for me, and also bring in his cousin Louis Marshall, who I am told is on his staff. I could forgive the latter's fighting against us, but not his joining Pope.
Lee's scorn for General Pope was also shared by his army, as his son Robert Jr. recorded.
We of the ranks used to have our opinions on all subjects. The armies, their generals, and their maneuvers were freely discussed. If there was one point on which the entire army was unanimous, I speak of the rank and file, it was that we were not in the least afraid of General Pope, but were perfectly sure of whipping him wherever we could meet him.
Robert Lee Jr.'s confidence was to prove well-founded. In a lightning strike during August 1862, he was able to bring superior forces to bear against Pope on the old battlefield of Bull Run near Manassas. There, the unfortunate Federal General Pope was contemptuously defeated. Washington was in panic as the defeated Federal army retreated on the capital, and a steamer with its boilers always fully stoked was maintained in readiness should it prove necessary to evacuate the president and his government. The possibility of a real Confederate victory was now seemingly within his grasp. Despite the promising look of the map after the victory against Pope, it has often been argued that the South could never really hope to win the war. The tired men of Lee's army would still have to fight the Battle of Antietam to reach Washington. Despite Lee's success over Pope, the superior federal resources of manpower and materiel rendered the victory at Manassas almost useless. Confederate losses had to be made good from a finite pool of manpower, but Yankee losses could, it seemed, almost always be made good, however severe the defeat. So even in the face of Pope's defeat, McClellan's fresh army still barred the way to Washington. The U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln, was shrewd enough to recognize this situation, and the war of attrition, which the South could not win, grew out of the seeds of the Battle of Antietam. The fight at Antietam Creek on 17 September 1862 between the armies of Lee and McClellan was to prove the single blackest day in the history of America. The battle was a bloody stalemate, but a stalemate in this war effectively meant a U.S. victory. Even in the face of 12,000 casualties, fresh federal troops were available to swell the ranks and continue the struggle. Lee's 14,000 casualties, however, spelled disaster for the Confederates. They simply did not have the manpower to trade losses like these with the Yankees. So, on the night of the 18th, Lee reluctantly gave the order to withdraw southwards from Maryland to Virginia. The first invasion of the North was over. As the army wearily returned to northern Virginia, the winter of 1862 set in. There was still no end in sight for the war. As his armies slowly recuperated, Lee took up winter quarters and waited. The scenes in his camp were later recalled by Robert Jr.
His quarters were very unpretentious, consisting of 3 or 4 wall tents and several more common ones. They were pitched on the edge of an old pine field near a grove of forest trees from which he drew his supply of firewood, while the pines helped to shelter the tents and horses from the cold winds. Though from the outside they were rather dismal, especially through the dreary winter, within they were cheerful and the surrounding as neat and comfortable as possible under the circumstances.
The restful life described by Robert Jr. was not destined to last for long, and it was not too long before the clouds of war were again gathering in the form of a superior federal force advancing to do battle in the heart of the Confederacy. The period of relative calm for the Confederates was about to be rudely shattered by what was to become known to posterity as the Battle of Fredericksburg. In the face of a strong federal advance, Lee, as always, had to think about conserving his precious manpower. So initially, he could do little more than wait and see.
I had supposed they were just preparing for battle, and I was saving our men for the conflict. Their hosts crown the hill and plain beyond the river, and their numbers to me are unknown. Still, I felt the confidence we could stand the shock, and was anxious for the blow that is to fall on some point, and was prepared to meet it here. Yesterday evening, I had my suspicions that they might return during the night, but could not believe they would relinquish their hopes after all their boasting and preparation. And when I say that the latter is equal to the former, you will have some idea of the magnitude. They suffered heavily as far as the battle went, but it did not go far enough to satisfy me. Our loss was comparatively slight, and I think it will not exceed 2,000. The contest will have now to be renewed, but on what field I cannot say.
The Battle of Fredericksburg was characterized by the fact that it was one of the mercifully few instances of a battle actually fought in the streets of a town during America's Civil War. The awful consequences of such a struggle were witnessed by the Confederate Army, who burned with rage at what they considered to be the unjustified bombardment of the town by the Yankee forces.
I saw then, and see now, no justification for the bombardment. True, the town was occupied by armed men, but the fire did not drive them out. It did drive out the women and children. I never saw a more pitiful procession than they made, trudging through the deep snow as the hour drew near. I saw little children tugging along with their doll babies, holding their feet up carefully above the snow, and women so old and feeble that they could carry nothing and barely hobble themselves. There were women carrying a baby in one arm and its bottle, clothes, and covering in the other. Most of them had to cross a creek, swollen with winter rains and deadly cold with winter ice and snow. Where they were going, we could not tell, and I doubt if they could.
In this instance, there was to be little justice of sorts. The Battle of Fredericksburg was to prove another famous victory for Lee and his army, which saw the Yankees leave the field in ignominious retreat. Even in the midst of victory, however, the thoughts of the noble Lee were for those who suffered the consequences of the battle, as Robert Jr. later recalled.
I did not see my father at any time during the fighting. Some days after it was all over, I saw him, as calm and composed as if nothing unusual had happened. And he never referred to his great victory, except to deplore the loss of his brave officers and soldiers or the sufferings of the sick and wounded. He repeatedly referred to the hardships so bravely endured by the inhabitants of Fredericksburg, who'd been obliged to flee from the town.
Despite their success at Fredericksburg, the supply situation was still desperate for the Confederates. As the Union blockade by land and sea began to make its iron grip felt, it became increasingly difficult to keep the Army supplied with even the bare essentials of life. These shortages were to be a theme which Lee returned to time and time again in this and other winters later in the war.
Nothing prevented my continuing in this front but the destitute condition of the men, thousands of whom are barefooted, a great number partially shod, and nearly all without overcoats, blankets, or warm clothing. I think the sublimest sight of war was the cheerfulness and alacrity exhibited by this army in the pursuit of the enemy under all the trials and privations to which it was exposed.
The main concern which Lee had, as always, was for the welfare of his men. His obvious love for his army was naturally observed and remarked upon by all. Naturally, Robert Lee, Jr. was not slow to point out these admirable qualities.
During this winter, which was a very severe one, the sufferings of General Lee's soldiers on account of insufficient shelter and clothing, the scant rations for man and beast, the increasing destitution throughout the country, and his inability to better these conditions bore heavily upon him. But he was bright and cheerful to those around him, never complaining of anyone nor about anything, and often indulging in his quaint humor. The dreary winter gradually passed away. Toward the last of April, the two armies, which had been opposite each other for 4 months, began to move. And about the 1st of May, the greatest of General Lee's battles was fought.
The battle which the younger Lee refers to was, of course, Chancellorsville, the supreme example of Robert E. Lee's skill as a strategist and operational commander. By a series of bold movements and a visionary flank march, superbly executed by Jackson, Lee was able to squarely defeat a much larger Federal army under Major General Joseph Hooker. The Federals had initially sought to trap Lee and ended up themselves in a trap. But the crushing Confederate victory was once again won at great cost, not just in terms of the 12,000 men who were lost. That was, of course, bad enough, But worse still for Lee was the news of the mortal wound received by Stonewall Jackson, Lee's most able and trusted subordinate general. At first, it looked as if Jackson would recover, and Lee, with typical modesty, offered full credit for the victory to Jackson. Robert Jr. later recalled his letters to the wounded Jackson.
The joy of our victory at Chancellorsville was saddened by the death of Stonewall Jackson. His loss was the heaviest blow the Army of Northern Virginia ever sustained. To Jackson's note telling him he was wounded, my father replied, "I cannot express regret at the occurrence. Could I have directed events, I should have chosen, for the good of the country, to have been disabled in your stead. I congratulate you on the victory, which is due to your skill and energy." Jackson said when this was read to him, "Better that 10 Jacksons should fall than 1 Lee." Afterward, when it was reported that Jackson was doing well, General Lee playfully sent him word, "You are better off than I am, for while you have only lost your left, I have lost my right arm." Then, hearing that he was worse, he said, "Tell him that I am praying for him as I believe I have never prayed for myself." After his death, General Lee wrote to my mother, "In addition to the deaths of officers and friends consequent upon the late battles, you will see that we have to mourn the loss of the great and good Jackson. Any victory would be dear at such a price. His remains go to Richmond today. I know not how to replace him. God's will be done. I trust he will raise up someone in his place."
Sadly for the Confederacy, there was to be no other Jackson raised up in his place. Perhaps if he had lived, the catastrophe, which was just around the corner, may have been averted. But despite the death of Jackson, through Southern eyes, the outlook for June 1863 had never seemed better. The immediate danger of federal invasion had again been lifted. Chancellorsville had, once again, seen the repulse of the Yankee threat, and it was now the turn of the rebels to try their mettle. Pride in Southern arms was now at its absolute zenith. The Army of Northern Virginia reached a peak of high spirits, and there was no better demonstration of this martial self-assurance than the General Cavalry Review staged by the 10,000 men of Jeb Stuart's Cavalry Corps on June 7, 1863. The entire cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia paraded for the general. Lee remembered the scene in a letter home to his wife.
I reviewed the cavalry in this section yesterday. It was a splendid sight. The men and horses looked well. They have recuperated since last fall. Stuart was in all his glory. Your sons and nephews were well flourishing. The country here looks very green and pretty, notwithstanding the ravages of war. What a beautiful world God in his loving kindness to his creatures has given us. What a shame that men, endowed with reason and knowledge of right, should mar his gifts.
Perhaps the same God to whom Lee offered his prayers now sought to punish those who marred his gifts and committed the sin of pride. On June 9th, only 2 days after the General's review, the newly formed U.S. Cavalry Corps under General Alfred Pleasonton crossed the Rappahannock River and for the first time fought toe-to-toe with Jeb Stuart's vaunted cavalry. This was the famous Battle of Brandy Station, and it was to prove a near-run thing. But in the end, the superiority of the rebel cavalry experience told, and the Yankees were rebuffed, but not until after Stuart and his command had received a severe fright. But there was worse news still for Lee. Among the rebel casualties was his son, Fitzhugh Lee. Fitzhugh was then a brigade commander in Jeb Stuart's Cavalry Corps. It was Lee's delicate duty to write to his wife, telling her the circumstances of their boy's injury.
My supplications continue to ascend for you, my children, and my country. When I last wrote, I did not suppose that Fitzhugh would be so soon sent to the rear disabled, and I hope it will be for a short time. I saw him the night after the battle, indeed met him on the field as they were bringing him from the front. He's young and healthy, and I trust will soon be up again. He seemed to be more concerned about his brave men and officers who had fallen in the battle than about himself.
Lee's initial prognosis appeared to be correct. Fitzhugh Lee was indeed to recover, but he was to spend those long hours recovering, not in the restful air of the plantation to which he had been dispatched, but in a federal prison. The convalescent Fitzhugh was captured by a party of Yankee soldiers sent to kidnap him from his sickbed. They did this despite the presence of his brother, Robert Jr.
About 2 weeks after our arrival, one lovely morning, as we all came out from the breakfast table, stepping out onto the front porch with Mrs. Wickham, we were much surprised to hear 2 or 3 shots down in the direction of the outer gate, where there was a large grove of hickory trees. I had not gone over 100 yards toward the grove when I saw, coming up at a gallop to the gate I was making for, 5 or 6 Federal cavalrymen. I knew what it meant at once. So I rushed back to the office and told my brother. He immediately understood the situation and directed me to get away. Said I could do no good by staying, that the soldiers would not and could not hurt him, and that there was nothing to be gained by my falling into their hands. But that, on the contrary, I might do a great deal of good by eluding them, making my way to North Wales, a plantation across the Pamunkey River, and saving our horses. I saw my brother brought out from the office on a mattress and placed in the Hickory Hill carriage, to which was hitched Mr. Wickham's horses, and then saw him driven away, a soldier on the box and a mounted guard surrounding him. This party had been sent out especially to capture him, and he was held as a hostage for the safety of some Federal officers we had captured for 9 long months. In a letter dated Culpeper, July 26, to my brother's wife, my father thus urged resignation.
Lee was now faced with the burden of personal tragedy, in addition to his onerous state responsibility. Fitzhugh's sickly wife, Charlotte, began to pine for her husband, and as her condition deteriorated, the compassionate general somehow found time to write to her.
You must not be sick while Fitzhugh is away, or he will be more restless under his separation. Get strong and hearty by his return, that he may the more rejoice at the sight of you. I can appreciate your distress at Fitzhugh's situation. I deeply sympathize with it, and in the lone hours of the night, I groan in sorrow at his captivity and separation from you. But we must bear it, exercise all our patience, and do nothing to aggravate the evil. Nothing would do him more harm than for him to learn that you were sick and sad. How could he get well? So cheer up and prove your fortitude and patriotism. You may think of Fitzhugh and love him as much as you please, but do not grieve over him or grow sad.
With his son in captivity, his daughter-in-law slowly dying, his ablest general dead, and his invincible cavalry command challenged at its own game, perhaps it's little wonder that Lee's second invasion of the North was to end in a tragedy of his own making. In late June 1863, once more eager to draw the Union Army away from Virginian soil, Lee gathered all of his forces together for a second invasion of the North. The proud Army of Northern Virginia, 65,000 strong, set off to capture Washington and so end the war. But this time their beloved leader would lose his touch. Still smarting from the insult of Brandy Station, Jeb Stuart led his cavalry off in a broad sweep through Union territory. According to many historians, his objective was to clear away the slight to his reputation which he had received at Brandy Station by a spectacular cavalry raid behind the Federal lines. Unfortunately, however, by doing so, he deprived the army of its eyes and ears at a crucial time. That crucial time was to produce the Battle of Gettysburg, a 3-day battle into which both armies almost blindly blundered into each other. As Lee's subsequent letters show, neither army had really expected to fight a battle there.
As to the Battle of Gettysburg, I must again refer you to the official accounts. Its loss was occasioned by a combination of circumstances. It was commenced in the absence of correct intelligence. It was continued in the effort to overcome the difficulties by which we were surrounded. And it would have been gained could one determined and united blow have been delivered by our whole line. As it was, victory trembled in the balance for 3 days. And the battle resulted in the infliction of as great an amount of injury as was received, and in frustrating the federal campaign for the season.
The united blow, which Lee mentions in his letter, was his reference to the events surrounding Pickett's charge on the 3rd day of the battle. Despite the expressed reservations of his staff officers, Lee felt that a concentrated effort against Cemetery Ridge would win the day for the rebels. He overruled General Longstreet, who felt that the attack on strong federal positions was madness and argued vociferously against the advance. Who knows? Had Stonewall Jackson been there, perhaps reason may have prevailed. But as it was, Lee overruled his unhappy Longstreet, and 15,000 men began the heroic advance, which was to become known to posterity as Pickett's Charge. In fact, it was not a charge, but a slow advance across completely open ground into the mouth of a superior emplaced force, ready and waiting on higher ground. Despite the fact that one rebel section actually reached the main line, the result was, as Longstreet had predicted, a total failure with an unacceptably high level of casualties. Lee, however, was man enough to shoulder the blame, and as the bloodied survivors, only 5,000 strong, reached the Confederate lines, he rode amongst them asking for forgiveness. "It's all my fault," were his immortal words. Once again, the battered Army of Northern Virginia was forced to retreat southwards, this time followed by a train of ambulances some 11 miles long. As they took up winter quarters, all must have sensed that the end was now inevitable. As the vice-like grip of the blockade took hold, the supply situation was becoming desperate. Once again, Lee was forced to write to his quartermasters.
The want of shoes and blankets in this army continues to cause much suffering and to impair its efficiency. In one regiment, I am informed that there are only 50 men with serviceable shoes, and a brigade that recently went on picket was compelled to leave several hundred men in camp who were unable to bear the exposure of duty, being destitute of shoes and blankets. The supply, by running the blockade, has become so precarious that I think we should turn our attention chiefly to our own resources, and I should like to be informed how far the latter can be counted upon.
In the face of this hardship, the Christian faith of the Army and its leader did a great deal to support them in adversity.
There was at this time a great revival of religion in the Army. My father became much interested in it and did what he could to promote in his camps all sacred exercise. Reverend J.W. Jones, in his personal reminiscences of General Lee, says, "General Lee's orders and reports always gratefully recognized the Lord of Hosts as the giver of victory and expressed a humble dependence upon and trust in him. His was a practical, everyday religion which supported him all through his life, enabled him to bear with equanimity every reverse of fortune, and to accept her gifts without undue elation."
One such reverse of fortune, which Lee must have found hard to endure, was the continuous refusal of the Federal Army to exchange his son. He often returned to that theme in his correspondence during the winter of 1863.
I have no idea when Fitzhugh will be exchanged. The federal authorities still resist all exchanges because they think it is to our interest to make them. Any desire expressed on our part for the exchange of any individual magnifies the difficulty, as they at once think some great benefit is to result to us from it. His detention is very grievous to me, and besides, I want his services.
Despite his own problems, Lee still had room for compassion for others. His selfless attitude was probably best summed up by his refusal to enrich himself from his successes while others suffered.
About this time, the people of the city of Richmond, to show their esteem for my father, desired to present him with a home. General Lee, on hearing of it, thus wrote to the President of the Council: "I assure you, sir, that no want of appreciation of the honor conferred upon me by this resolution, or insensitivity to the kind feelings which prompted it, induce me to ask, as I most respectfully do, that no further proceedings be taken with reference to the subject. The house is not necessary for the use of my family, and my own duties will prevent my residence in Richmond. I should therefore be compelled to decline the generous offer, and I trust that whatever means the City Council may have to spare for this purpose may be devoted to the relief of the families of our soldiers in the field, who are more in want of assistance and more deserving it than myself."
Fitzhugh's wife, Charlotte, grew slowly worse, and it was by now obvious that she would die. He therefore allowed his other son, Custis, to offer himself as a hostage to the Federal Army so that Fitzhugh could be allowed to visit his dying wife in her last moments. This compassionate and humanitarian request was peremptorily refused, and poor Charlotte slipped away while her husband, languished in prison, refused even the chance to share her last moments. To his credit, Lee refused to be bitter even in such heartbreaking circumstances. Once again, his faith seems to have carried him through.
Custis's dispatch, which I received last night, demolished all the hopes in which I had been indulging during the day of dear Charlotte's recovery. What a glorious thought it is that she has joined her little cherubs and our angel Annie in heaven. Thus is link by link the strong chain broken that binds us to earth, and our passage soothed to another world.
Despite his own domestic pain, Lee never forgot the needs of his men, as Lee Jr. recalled.
In that winter and spring of 1864, every possible exertion was made by my father to increase the strength of his army and to improve efficiency. He knew full well that the enemy was getting together an enormous force and that his vast resources would be put forth to crush us in the spring. His letters at this time to President Davis and the Secretary of War show how well he understood the difficulties of his position. To the last, he remained full of resources, energetic and defiant, and ready to bear upon his shoulders the whole burden of the conduct of the war. Mr. President, my anxiety on the subject of provisions is so great that I cannot refrain from expressing it to Your Excellency. I cannot see how we can operate within the present supplies. Any derangement in their arrival or disaster to the railroad would render it impossible for me to keep the army together and might force a retreat into North Carolina.
Lee was never to make his retreat into North Carolina. Instead, he would stand his ground and once again defeat superior Yankee forces, this time at Spotsylvania and the Wilderness. As always, however, the victory was won at high cost to the Confederacy. The losses in manpower incurred in keeping the Yankees at bay meant that the Confederacy could from now on effectively fight only a defensive war. Even so, Lee Jr. still could not see the writing on the wall.
Older heads may have begun to see the beginning of the end when they saw that slaughter and defeat did not deter our enemy, but made him more determined in his hammering process. But it never occurred to me, and to thousands and thousands like me, that there was any occasion for uneasiness.
To an older head like General Long, however, the end was clearly in sight. Nonetheless, even he was impressed by the dogged manner in which Lee stuck to his duty.
In none of them does he show a symptom of despair or breathe a thought of giving up the contest. To the last, he remained full of resources, energetic and defiant, and ready to bear upon his shoulders the whole burden of the conduct of the war.
As with the victory at Chancellorsville, The rebel success at Spotsylvania was marred by the death of one of its great commanders, Jeb Stuart. As a result of a small affair at Yellow Tavern, the last great hero of the Confederacy was dead. As with the death of Jackson, the loss of Stuart was a body blow to Lee. Lee Jr. recalled the events.
They met at Yellow Tavern, 6 miles from Richmond. General Stuart, with 3 brigades of Confederate cavalry, were attacked so fiercely that they were held there nearly all day, giving time for the troops around and in Richmond to concentrate for their defense of the city. In this fight, General Stuart fell mortally wounded, and he died on the next day in Richmond. The death of our noted cavalry leader was a great blow to our cause, a loss second only to that of General Jackson. My father's words were, "Stuart has been mortally wounded, a most valuable and able officer. He never brought me a piece of false information." What praise dear to a soldier's heart could fall from the lips of the commanding general touching his chief of cavalry? These simple words of Lee constitute, I think, the fittest inscription for the monument that is soon to be erected to the memory of the greatest cavalry leader of the Army of Northern Virginia. Among the gallant soldiers who have fallen in this war, General Stuart was second to none in valor, in zeal, and in unflinching devotion to his country.
By now, the Confederate Army was fighting only defensive battles, and it was at one of those, fought at Cold Harbor in 1864, that Lee would record his last victory. General Long, a veteran of the Army, recalled their courage.
In no previous operations did the Army of Northern Virginia display higher soldierly qualities. Regardless of numbers, every breach was filled, and with unparalleled stubbornness, its lines were maintained. The soldiers of that army not only gratified their countrymen, but by their gallantry and vigor, won the admiration of their enemies. Wherever the men in blue appeared, they were met by those in gray, and muzzle to muzzle and point to point, they measured their foeman's strength.
Drawing on his previous experience as an engineer, Lee was living up to his nickname, the King of Spades, by digging in behind earthworks and trenches. The Confederates were at last able to inflict more casualties than they received. At Cold Harbor, their resistance was so fierce that the Union forces simply refused to attack anymore, as a Union officer recalled. The order was issued through these officers, the corps commanders, to their subordinate commanders, and from them descended through the wanted channels. But no man stirred, and the immobile lines pronounced a verdict, silent yet emphatic, against further slaughter. The loss on the Union side in this sanguinary action was more than 13,000, while on the part of the Confederates it is doubtful whether it reached that many hundreds. Grinding the U.S. Army of the Potomac to a halt at Cold Harbor was to be Lee's last victory. Lee knew, however, that even success like Cold Harbor would not long stem the tide. The flood of men and materiel on the U.S. side was just too great. He pressed Confederate President Jefferson Davis to allow him to abandon Richmond to the Yankees so he could carry on the fight from the Carolinas, where his men would be better supplied. But the president would not hear of it. Lee was ordered to stay and defend Richmond.
The two armies now commenced a contest which could end only one way. If General Lee had been permitted to evacuate Petersburg and Richmond, to fall back upon some interior point near supplies for man and beast and within supporting distance of the remaining forces of the Confederacy, the surrender would have certainly been put off, possibly never have taken place, and the result of the war changed. The Army of the Potomac placed itself on the James, through whose channel it had easy access to the wide world, whence to secure for itself the unlimited supply of men and munitions of war. General Lee was left with a line 30 miles long to defend and with only 35,000 men to hold it. and with no chance of reinforcements or reserves with which to fill up the ranks, lessened daily by the death in battle and by disease. Lee was opposed to the final defense of Richmond that was urged upon him for political, not military reasons. It was a great strategic error.
Despite his reservations, Lee and his small force loyally continued to defend Richmond throughout the winter of 1864 and into the spring of 1865. But as the supply situation grew more desperate, Lee's repeated requests to abandon the capital grew more frequent. Nonetheless, he maintained his dignity and personal standing throughout the long siege. General Long of the Confederate Army recalled Lee at this stage of the war.
General Lee continued in excellent health and bore his many cares with his usual equanimity. He had aged somewhat in appearance since the beginning of the war, but had rather gained than lost in physical vigor from the severe life he had led. His hair had grown gray, but his face had the ruddy hue of health, and his eyes were as clear and bright as ever. His dress was always a plain gray uniform, with cavalry boots reaching to his knees and a broad-brimmed gray felt hat. He seldom wore a weapon, and his only mark of rank were the stars on his collar. Though always abstemious in diet, he seemed able to bear any amount of fatigue, being capable of remaining in his saddle all day and at his desk half the night. No commander was ever more careful and never had care for the comfort of an army given rise to greater devotion. He was constantly calling the attention of the authorities to the wants of his soldiers, making every effort to provide them with food and clothing. The feeling for him was one of love, not of awe or dread. They could approach him with the assurance that they would be received with kindness and consideration, and that any just complaint would receive proper attention. There was no condescension in his manner, but he was ever simple, kind, and sympathetic. And his men, while having unbounded faith in him as leader, almost worshipped him as a man. These relations of affection and mutual confidence between the army and its commander had much to do with the undaunted bravery displayed by the men, and more than a due share in the many victories they gained.
The year 1865 had now commenced, with the Confederates besieged in Petersburg and Richmond. That thin gray line still repulsed every attempt of the enemy to break through it, but daily its strength was becoming less. The end seemed in sight when Fort Fisher was captured. Fisher was the last open port to the outside world, and its capture cut off all further foreign supplies and munitions. Sherman had reached Savannah in December, from which point he was ready to unite with Grant at any time. From General Lee's letters, official and private, one gets a clear view of the desperateness of his position. He had been made commander-in-chief of all military forces in the Confederate States on February 6th. In his order issued on accepting this command, he wrote,
I am deeply impressed with the difficulties and responsibilities of the position, and humbly invoking the guidance of Almighty God, I rely for success upon the courage and fortitude of the Army, sustained by the patriotism and firmness of the people, confident that their united efforts under the blessing of heaven will secure peace and independence.
On April 1st, 1865, the Battle of Five Forks was fought, where about 50,000 infantry and cavalry, far more men than were in the entire rebel army, attacked the extreme right of the Confederate Army and turned it. To save his communications, Lee had at last to abandon his lines at Petersburg, giving up that city and Richmond. Attempting to slip through the huge array of forces gathered against him, Lee's little army tried to evade the encroaching Federals and make for North Carolina, there to continue the fight. But it was not to be. They were pursued and surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee must finally have realized that any further resistance was futile. The London Evening Standard commented on this stage of the war. Brilliant as were General Lee's earlier triumphs, we believe that he gave no higher proofs of his genius than in his last campaign, and that hardly any of his victories was so honorable to himself and his army as that of his 6 days' retreat. The perfect general, doing his duty to the last, Lee was still not quite sure that the absolute end of the road had finally been reached. He therefore ordered one last attack on the Yankees. Robert Jr. was there.
After his last attempt was made with Gordon and Fitz Lee to break through the lines of the enemy in the early morning of the 9th, Colonel Venable informed him that it was not possible. Lee said, "Then there is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant." When someone near him, hearing this, said, "Oh, General, what will history say of the surrender of the army in the field?" He replied, "Yes, I know that they will say hard things of us. They will not understand how we were overwhelmed by numbers. But that is not the question, Colonel. The question is it right to surrender this army? If it is right, then I will take all responsibility."
The touching scene of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse is known throughout the world. With dignity and solemnity, Lee offered his surrender to General Grant in order to stop any further unnecessary effusion of blood. General Long witnessed the scene as Lee left the courthouse.
General Lee again appeared. A shout of welcome instinctively went up from the army. But instantly recollecting the sad occasion that brought him before them, their shouts sank into silence. Every hat was raised, and the bronzed faces of thousands of grim warriors were bathed in tears. As he rode slowly along the lines, hundreds of his devoted veterans pressed around the noble chief, trying to take his hand, touch his person, or even lay their hands upon his horse, thus exhibiting for him their great affection. The general, then with head bare and tears flowing freely down his manly cheeks, bade adieu to the army. Men, we have fought through the war together. I have done my best for you. My heart is too full to say more. After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the survivors of so many hard-fought battles who have remained steadfast to the last that I have consented to this result from no distrust of them. But, feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that would have attended the continuation of the contest, I have determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. By the terms of the agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain there until exchanged. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed, and I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessing and protection. With an increasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration of myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
I wish I was in Dixie, away, away. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live or die for Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Land of cotton, old times never not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland. Dixie.